Blessings everyone, this is Reverend Aphren with the Four Pillars Proto-Temple. This evening I want to do a video about the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin. Now, obviously Kuan Yin is not necessarily a pagan or a Wiccan deity. However, it's something that Kuan Yin's always been very close to me, and I've always had such a relationship and a history with Kuan Yin, so I'd really like to be able to share a bit about her and do a video on this. Now, this video is going to be a little bit lengthy because I am going to be talking about other aspects of Kuan Yin and her history and her development, because she's a very interesting deity and how she's developed over time. I want to tell you a little bit, firstly, about me and my relationship with Kuan Yin. Kuan Yin, I've always been kind of, interested in Kuan Yin. It really started about maybe six or so years ago. I became interested in her and introduced to her through my Buddhist studies in college, and so I started to learn more about Kuan Yin and about the Bodhisattva, and what the Bodhisattva is and how people attempt to become Bodhisattvas in life. And so I learned a lot about Kuan Yin and her worship and things of that nature. And during this video I'm also going to show you a lot of the imagery and iconography I have of Kuan Yin as well, to share with you a little bit about that. And so hopefully you'll enjoy that. Now, I wanted to, like I said, talk a lot about Kuan Yin and her development. I find the study of Kuan Yin to be very interesting, and I find the fact that Kuan Yin was actually used to be depicted as male, and has since become female and depicted almost exclusively as female as Kuan Yin. And so I wanted to talk a lot about that in that as well. So that's what this video is going to be about. It's going to be about Kuan Yin and about her development as well. So before we go into exactly who Kuan Yin is and about her worship and her veneration, I want to talk a little bit about what exactly a bodhisattva is. Now, in Buddhism, they actually have two different terms to refer generally to the same thing. They use the term bodhisattva and arhat. Now, arhat is a word that is used predominantly in Theravada Buddhism, which is a sect of Buddhism. And an arhat is basically a being that has reached enlightenment. And because they've reached enlightenment, they become kind of like a saint in a way. And so another word, people might refer to them as Buddhist saints, although that's not exactly correct. So an arhat rather is generally a being that has reached enlightenment. So a lot of the early Buddhist masters, especially ones that were surrounding the Buddha himself, other beings that the early beings like the other beings, disciples of the Buddha. A lot of them that have reached enlightenment, they're referred to as arhats, which is a being that's reached enlightenment. Now, a bodhisattva is similar in that way. A bodhisattva, the word bodhisattva means wisdom being. Bodhi meaning wisdom, and sattva or sattva meaning being. And so a bodhisattva is actually a being that has reached enlightenment. Now, the difference between a regular being, an arhat, which is predominantly Theravada, a bodhisattva is predominantly Mahayana, which is another sect of Buddhism. Mahayana meaning the great vehicle, and that's the reason they call themselves Mahayana is because they are a sect of Buddhism that is tailored to meet everyone's needs, specifically through the practice of upaya. Upaya means skillful means, and it's there are many different skillful means depending on what your personal temperament is and how you could personally develop and reach enlightenment yourself. So through upaya, people are cultivating their own inner light, their inner being. It's called bodhicitta, and that bodhicitta eventually leads to gaining merit and eventually to you becoming enlightened. Now, the enlightened beings, particularly bodhisattvas, although they become enlightened, when you reach nirvana, you actually reach nirvana in this lifetime. So when you become fully realized and awakened as a fully realized being, you become a bodhisattva in this life. Now, after you pass away, you reach what they call paranirvana, or the final nirvana. And so that nirvana happens after you've passed away. Now, for a bodhisattva, they never actually reach parinirvana. What happens is when they pass away, they've reached enlightenment, they've reached nirvana in this life, but when they pass away, instead of being reincarnated, which they don't have to because they've reached enlightenment. They don't need to be reincarnated anymore, and they aren't entangled in the constant cycles of life and death and rebirth because they're free of attachment. So they do not need to be reincarnated, and they can go to parinirvana, which again is a state of being. However, they choose not to. So they deliberately choose not to reincarnate, not to go on to parinirvana, and they choose instead to reincarnate. And by choosing to reincarnate, they reincarnate again as a human in our world to help bring enlightenment to all beings. And they take a vow which says that they will not fully reach nirvana. They will not allow themselves to move forward into parinirvana until they have been fully enlightened all beings on the earth. So it's a very, very high and noble calling, and most people that are practitioners of Mahayana Buddhism, they will take a bodhisattva vow, which is essentially that they vow in their life to reach enlightenment so that they can be reincarnated to help other beings reach enlightenment. So that's their goal really in life as part of members of the Mahayana sect of Buddhism. And so Kuan Yin is a bodhisattva. She's a being that in essence has chosen not to cease to exist and be entered into parinirvana. She's chosen in fact to continue to reincarnate to be able to help all beings. So that's the main difference there between exactly what a bodhisattva is and how it fits into our discussion. So the bodhisattva vow is this. The bodhisattva, again, is someone who chooses not to be enlightened to help other beings, and the vow that they take is this. Beings are infinite in number. I vow to save them all. The obstructive passions are endless in number. I vow to end them all. The teachings of saving others are countless. I vow to learn them all. Buddhahood is the supreme achievement. I vow to attain it. So the main driving force of the bodhisattva, of course, is compassion, and the bodhisattva attempts to cultivate within themselves something which I mentioned a moment ago, bodhicitta, which means the awakened mind, and they do this through deep compassion and deep compassionate deeds. So of course, there are 37 verses on the practice of the Bodhisattva, which was written by a teacher called Thigme, and he explains a little bit more in detail about exactly what the Bodhisattva is and how they're supposed to operate in this. It says, in short, wherever I am, whatever I do, to be continually mindful and alert, asking, what is the state of my mind? And accomplishing the good of others is the practice of a bodhisattva. Dedicating to enlightenment through wisdom purified of the three concepts, all merit achieved by this endeavor to remove the suffering of countless beings is the practice of the bodhisattva. So in order to really understand kind of how Kuan Yin developed in the way that she did, we have to talk a little bit about the cultural climate and the cultural religious landscape of the East versus the West. Now, in the West, our religious history has predominantly been Christian, and because of that, there's been a very strong emphasis on practicing one path, practicing one way, practicing the true way, which of course many believe is Christianity. And so there's always been this idea of wanting to shun other religious practices because they're not true and they're not part of the religious majority. Now in the East, that's not the case. In the East, they don't practice simply one faith always. Now you find in a lot of different areas people might practice Hinduism and Buddhism. You can see elements of Hinduism in Buddhism. Some people that practice Buddhism, practice other forms of religion as well. You can be a Buddhist pagan, a Buddhist Christian, all sorts of different things. In addition to that, you find very much in China, at least there was in one time, people who would practice Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism all at the same time. And so it was kind of like a conglomeration of all of them. Buddhism obviously being sort of like a religious practice, Taoism being sort of a spiritual or mystical practice, and Confucianism being more of a legal or ethical practice. And so all three of those sort of created this trifecta of, all aspects of life in China. And so people would practice, various aspects and elements of each of the three religions at that time. And of course, when Buddhism moved into Japan and in other parts of the East, the similar thing happened. I mean, you find people who practice Shintoism as well as Buddhism, and in fact there was at one point before the Meiji Restoration where people would mix the two religions so closely that you couldn't tell if it was Buddhist or if it was Shinto. There was absolutely no way to tell the difference. And even today, you'll find some old shrines and temples that have aspects of both faiths. You'll find Buddhist temples which have small auxiliary shrines to various kami. You'll find in Shinto shrines different Buddhist statues or scriptures or Buddhist-style chanting or something, or pagodas, which was really popular in Buddhist temples and monasteries. You'll find them sometimes in Shinto shrines too, which is not very common, but it was something that was during that time of the syncretic relationship between the two faiths. So, that sort of religious landscape is what really allowed Kuan Yin's worship to travel, develop, and flourish in the way that it has, which again we'll be discussing here very shortly. So please keep that in mind as we talk about this, that the landscapes are completely different, and the two worlds are worlds apart, in fact. So let's begin at the very beginning of Kuan Yin in her worship and her iconography practice. So one of the oldest and most well-known manifestations of Kuan Yin is the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. In Tibet, Avalokiteshvara is Sanskrit. The topic of Avalokiteshvara is very complex and not really easily understood. It is difficult to understand exactly how this Bodhisattva fits into the Buddhist religion. Some sources seem to suggest that the Bodhisattva is a more powerful or important than the Buddha himself, and that he has existed longer than Sakyamuni Buddha, who Sakyamuni Buddha is the historical Buddha, the Buddha of the Sakyamuni clan, who is the one that most of these modern-day Buddhist practices are built upon. This is a complicated issue, which is difficult for someone with the Western mind to, really who's used to facts and linear progressions to really understand, because Avalokiteshvara was predominantly venerated in Tibet. However, his worship traveled all around the world. This may be due to Tibet in exile, during the 1950s, late 50s, early 60s, when the Chinese came in and overtook Tibet, and the Dalai Lama and his retinue had left and moved to India and had taken some of these Buddhist practices with them, which spread his worship, or possibly because of the transformation from a male Bodhisattva into the female Kuan Yin as the practice spread through China. In Tibet, it was believed that the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara is the patron Bodhisattva of the country because he took interest in the affairs of the Tibetans specifically. This idea was supported originally by belief in the Dalai Lama, the leader of one of the four sects of Tibetan Buddhism, and also the previous political leader of Tibet. And the belief is that, so there are four schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and they're based upon different practices. Now, the leader of Tibet, the Dalai Lama, is actually from I believe it's the Yellow Hat school, if I'm correct in that, and that order believes that the Dalai Lama is the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, and so he's kind of a living bodhisattva in our modern era, and that's what's really led to this really important emphasis on the Dalai Lama, his worship, his veneration, and on this succession of Dalai Lama. So it's really important as well. It is believed that this being made a conscious choice to reincarnate as the Dalai Lama to continue work with the affairs of the Tibetans specifically. In more abstract form, Avalokiteshvara is considered to be the actual emanation of the Buddha himself, in the form of his profound compassion for all beings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, there was a point when it's believed that Sakyamuni Buddha had a moment of profound compassion for someone, and through this profound compassion, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara was sort of emanated from him. That's one belief. So it is said that Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva is said to be able to appear in any form, if necessary, to save all beings. In some cases, he could appear as Buddha, as a god, or even as Jesus. He could also appear in the form of a human boy, girl, nun, or monk, or any number of things to help beings who need it. One powerful story that I love to tell of Avalokiteshvara illustrates his profound care and interest in the affairs of all beings. In this story, the Bodhisattva descends into the hot levels of hell to save all the beings suffering found there. His presence cools the fires of hell and the beings inside, and in the end to all of their suffering. The understanding of Avalokiteshvara is further skewed when we talk about his connection with Hindu deities. Some stories tell of how the Bodhisattva created the world and also created all of the Hindu gods, giving them permission to rule. It causes one to wonder how a mere bodhisattva, whose goal it is to save all beings from suffering, could be powerful enough to create the world and even gods. So it is apparent that Avalokiteshvara is not really restricted to just one location or one practice or pantheon, but his worship has really been cross-cultural in many ways. The connection between Kuan Yin and Avalokiteshvara is somewhat difficult to articulate. The transformation from male bodhisattva to a female deity might not have been as simple as a one-point transformation there, but on a more profound and complex process. So although Avalokiteshvara is primarily reserved to Tibetan Buddhism, Kuan Yin is really unique because she doesn't really belong to any particular form of religion or worship. So her essence is so profound that it cannot be confined by any creed, doctrine, or practice. Interestingly enough, though, it is the fact that she is not associated with any particular tradition that there's really been no attempt to produce a single religion focused entirely on her. So there's really no one true cult or type of worship of Kuan Yin-ism or something like that. There's really nothing like that. According to the research that I've done, it seems that the shift from the male Avalokiteshvara, again Tibetan Buddhist deity, to Kuan Yin occurred during the 8th century of the current era. Some people claim that this was simply a matter of semantics because the name Avalokiteshvara translated into Chinese as Kuan Yin. Others claim that this may have actually been a little bit more complicated. The earliest representations of Kuan Yin in China were actually surprisingly male, and had many male features until later in history. The Silk Road, of course we all know about the Silk Road and the trade route, in northwestern of China seems to be the origin of the worship of Kuan Yin in the mainland China, and it spread from there to Japan and other parts of the Eastern Asia. So some believe that the best evidence for the transformation comes from Buddhist texts being translated into Chinese. There was a particular Chinese author, Chunfang Yu, who claimed that the evidence of images of Kuan Yin occurred shortly after the translation of the sutras. So when they were originally translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, that's when you started to see a shift in the iconography, a shift
Other
in the
writers
in
have
the
suggested
worship,
that
Kuan Yin is actually some combination of Avalokiteshvara and the Tibetan deity Tara. Tara is almost always depicted as female in a female aspect and she's kind of the emanation of compassion, because she is the emanation of Avalokiteshvara. And so that's kind of an interesting story as well. The story goes is that Tara was actually an emanation of Avalokiteshvara, or sometimes the Buddha. And during one period of immense feelings of compassion, the Buddha shed a single tear. And from that single tear emanated the energy and the essence of pure compassion, which came to be the goddess Tara. Now, this I believe is the green Tara, and there's actually 21 different Tara: green Tara, white Tara, gold Tara, all these different Tara. So just be aware of that. But this one Tara sometimes is often confused with Kuan Yin, or vice versa, because Kuan Yin being the goddess of mercy, the goddess of compassion, as well Tara being this emanation of the pure compassion of the Buddha. So it's kind of difficult to separate them sometimes, and there's a very simple confusion there in that case as well. One author actually claimed that Chinese developed over time a combination of Avalokiteshvara and Tara, which became the image of Kuan Yin as we know her today. The only evidence that he really presents, though, is that his teacher witnessed earlier artwork of Tara, which appeared to be in Kuan Yin's likeness, and came to that conclusion on his own. So we really have no other evidence aside from his eyewitness account there. So since Tara is the extension of Avalokiteshvara, or in the compassion of the Buddha, in some cases, it would seem redundant to develop a being which is a combination of the two, since they were already one being, Tara being an emanation of Avalokiteshvara. So it doesn't really make any sense. With little evidence and no reason for the redundant combination, it seems that the explanation for the transition from male to female in that case is unfounded. The most plausible explanation seems to be the most logical explanation. It seems that although it is not impossible for men to be compassionate, it would appear that it is more appropriate in most cases for women to have that quality, that compassionate quality. So women as mother are nurturing, caring, and compassionate, and it would be difficult to see men with those qualities. Not that they can't, but sometimes generally. It seems that many people would be more comfortable with a compassionate, caring female than a male one, since men are often interpreted with qualities as opposed active qualities, as opposed to passive qualities of compassion and caring and things like that. The worship or devotion to a female deity of mercy and compassion may have been more approachable, comfortable, and plausible for most people. Whatever the reason, eventually for the transition from male to female, there's no doubt eventually that it did occur. Because of the interrelated nature of Kuan Yin and Avalokiteshvara, much of what is known about them is the same, but no matter which one it is that you're researching. Because they are virtually one in the same, their qualities are nearly identical. Many sources of information about Avalokiteshvara are used by those who revere Kuan Yin to illustrate her qualities and potential. One of the most important sources to explain the qualities of Avalokiteshvara, Kuan Yin, is a sutra called the Lotus Sutra. This is a really important sutra in Mahayana Buddhism. It was given by Sakyamuni Buddha, but depicts many things, including multiple bodhisattvas, parables, and qualities of enlightened beings. This is one of the earliest texts of Buddhism to be translated into Chinese, and it marks the transition of the Dharma to China. The 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra is the most important section to understanding Avalokiteshvara, and by extension Kuan Yin. So the Lotus Sutra, discusses, as I said, many different qualities of the bodhisattvas, and the transformation from Avalokiteshvara into Kuan Yin may not have been so difficult of a change for those in the East as Westerners to understand. The Lotus Sutra illustrates the idea that the bodhisattva may appear in whatever form is best. They say, quote, this bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara displays such qualities, wanders through the land in various forms, and saves sentient beings. So because of the belief, because of that belief, there's really no issue with the fact that the bodhisattva can change from being male to female, and the people in the East wouldn't have batted an eyelash in that case to even wonder, like, okay, who's this? It doesn't make any sense. It's just a different way. It's a different way for people to, it's easy to see, especially if you read the Lotus Sutra, to see how Avalokiteshvara also known as Kuan Yin, could easily have been translated into the female image of Kuan Yin that we have today and worshipped almost completely separate from Buddhism because of the language of the Lotus Sutra and this idea of Kuan Yin coming to you if you need help and just simply pray to her, etc., etc. This sort of relationship was very powerful and very, very transformative for many people. Now, there is a basic understanding of what a bodhisattva is and how Kuan Yin came to be in her present form. Let's talk a little bit about the qualities and personality of Kuan Yin herself. The name Kuan Yin, or more properly the full name Kuan Shi Yin, means she who hears the cries of the world. This is one of the most telling aspects of who she is. The most well-known aspect of Kuan Yin is the capacity of the Savior. As the hearer of the cries of the world, Kuan Yin is capable of acknowledging all the prayers which are sent to her from all those in need. The many sutras which speak of her claim that all beings who call upon her will be saved simply because they called her name. That's it. No strings attached. The Lotus Sutra outlines all of the situations in which the Bodhisattva would help devotees and also states, and I quote, "If innumerable hundreds of thousands of myriads of kotis of beings who experience suffering hear of Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara and wholeheartedly chant his name, Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara will immediately perceive their voices and free them from their suffering." It stands to reason that the primary goal of the Bodhisattva, and Kuan Yin in particular, is to be a savior of all beings, without exception, all beings. Many sutras depict Kuan Yin as an attendant of the Buddha and in a number of his entourage. Many scholars claim that she is simply an attendant and not an individual savior. The biggest evidence for the predominance of Kuan Yin in Eastern thought is shown in the number of devotional iconography, which centers around her specifically. In this regard, she is separate from the Buddhist cosmology and takes her own individuality separate from the Buddha. There is a series of mystical texts which attribute many more qualities to Kuan Yin and differentiate her from the Buddha. In earlier texts, she is seen as subordinate to Sakyamuni Buddha and Amitabha Buddha, who is the Buddha of the Pure Land. But in esoteric texts, she is seen as more independent from them. This independence could be the reason why Kuan Yin has taken on separate worship of her own from the worship within the Buddhist cosmology. The mere existence of Kuan Yin as a bodhisattva is not enough for devotees, and it is not efficacious without worship of, devotion to, or reverence for her. The most common way of working with this bodhisattva is through devotion toward her. Daily devotions are performed to Kuan Yin in the form of prayers or meditations, and many offerings are given to her. Traditionally, she is offered flowers, which represent the impermanence of life, but she is also offered water and incense as well. In some group devotional practices, pilgrimages are taken in her honor to special places of worship that are sacred to her, and periods of group chanting are done in praise of Kuan Yin and her many attributes and deeds. The recitation of many different mantras is also done in her name, such as the Great Compassion Mantra, the Dharini of Great Compassion, and also the recitation of chapters from the Lotus Sutra, which concerns her. The devotion to this bodhisattva is particularly focused around her iconography and imagery. This is not a form of idolatry, really, but the images are important ways of understanding the attributes and qualities of Kuan Yin, and the imagery brings devotees closer to her. There are several different ways that she can be depicted, and they depend upon the area and the culture. So I just want to pause there and talk a little bit about the iconography of Kuan Yin. So I'm going to show you some of the icons that I have of Kuan Yin, and then we'll talk a little bit about what some of the things mean. So I have a couple different ones here because, as I said, Kuan Yin has kind of been in and out of my life. I've never really been a official devotee of Kuan Yin or anything like that, but she's just been, around my life, and I've collected many, many different statues of her. So let me just show you some of the ones I have here. So the first one here is really small. This one here is of Kuan Yin, and you can't really see, it's kind of blurry because it's so small. She's sitting on a lotus, and she's holding in her hand a small flower. A little flower. You can see the tip of the flower right there. She's holding a flower across her body like that. That's just a small one there that I have, a small little Kuan Yin. I have a bigger one here, and this one looks like she's carrying a flower of some sort as well. She kind of reminds me, see the flower there? You can see the flower. She's standing on a lotus as well. And she kind of reminds me a little bit, if you look, especially with the hair and the head there. I apologize, the light, you can't really see the depth of the face there, so I apologize. But she looks almost like Mother Mary. There's a church over not far from me, and it's a larger congregation, and they have a big statue of Mary, and I swear it looks just like this. And I'm like, that's Kuan Yin. I always joke. It's actually Kuan Yin. Here's another statue. This is a big one. This is gorgeous. It's made out of wood. If you look closer, you can again see the veil on her head, and you can see she's just very, very, meditative, contemplative there. She doesn't have anything in her hands in this one. She's just kind of crossing her hands there. She doesn't have anything in her hands, which is notable. We'll talk about that a little bit more. She's just standing on a base there, but this one is made out of wood as well. It's gorgeous. I actually have a large picture of Kuan Yin as well, and this one's really important. We'll talk a little bit about the iconography of this one as well. If you see this one, you see she's holding a branch in her hand. It's a willow branch, and she's pouring out some sort of a liquid. You'll see there it is. Woo, pouring, splash, splash, pouring out the liquid. There it is, and she's on the lotus. This is a huge picture. I have actually two of these. So there's that one there of Kuan Yin. And then finally, there's this one, which is one of my favorites. And this one here, you've probably seen it. You can get different ones with Buddha or other deities in it as well. So it's a round container like this. It's like a capsule, and it sits like this. I don't know if you've ever seen it. On the back side, there's a little bit of you can't really see with this blue light here. Let me see if I can. Oh, you can't really see it. But on the back side here, there's a bridge. You can kind of see the bridge there. And then there's like a little nature scene. And there's a little pagoda building right there. And there's a little bridge on the back side. So it's really pretty, and it has these nice little curved roof. And then around the front, there's some Chinese written on that I can't read. If anybody can, go ahead and comment. Let me know what it is. And you open it up. It actually opens. Some people have said it's for travel. Take it with you and then just open it up wherever you are. It actually opens. This is impressive, so I just want to show you the whole thing. Da, 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 da. And it opens like this. And obviously in the back side is Kuan Yin, and she's flanked by her attendants. So there she is in the back side. And you see in her hand, she's holding a vase. And she has her hand up, but in her other hand she's holding a vase. And so what you would do is you would hold this, you would sit this down, and you would hold it open, and you might put a candle there or make offerings. And so when you close it, when you're ready to do your devotions, you open it up, and you prepare yourself to work with Kuan Yin. So that's one of my favorite ones there. So pretty excited about those. I'm glad I was able to show everyone those. So now that we've seen some of the imagery, let's talk a little bit about exactly what those images mean. So one of the earliest depictions of Kuan Yin is called the Water Moon Kuan Yin. I unfortunately don't have an example of the Water Moon Kuan Yin. This is an interesting depiction because it has no basis in any sort of religious text about Kuan Yin. It's not in the Lotus Sutra. It's not written in anything. So it's just sort of this image that's kind of come along with Kuan Yin, and there's really no scriptural evidence of it. The only basis for this version of Kuan Yin is found in the title of a small sutra, which is entitled Moonlight in Water Kuan Yin Bodhisattva Sutra spoken by the Buddha. That's really the only evidence we have. And of course, it depicts Kuan Yin sitting with water. Sometimes she'll be depicted with water at her feet, and then there'll be a moon above her. And it has something to do with this sort of reflection, the reflection of the moon into the water, and this idea of the reflection not really being the moon. It's a reflection of the moon, and realizing that the reality, you look in the water and you think that's the moon, there's the moon. No, that's not the moon. The moon's above you. The moon is behind you. You can't see the moon because you're distracted with the reflection. And that's part of this sort of story, lesson, parable that image is supposed to convey, is that the reality of what you think is reality isn't really reality. You have to open yourself up and see the bigger picture of things, and realize that the reflection is not the moon. It's simply the reflection, and it's an illusion of what the moon really is. Another interesting characteristic of this depiction of, I think I've gotten ahead of myself. Yes. Another interesting depiction of this characteristic of this depiction of Kuan Yin is the masculine qualities which are evident in the imagery, including facial features and even facial hair in some cases. The form of Kuan Yin is one of the earliest because that is one of the more masculine forms of the moonlit water Kuan Yin, prior to the transition to the female. The water and the moon is the representation, are meant to represent the ever-changing world and the constant changing, and to represent the idea that, again, as I said, the world is an illusion. This version of Kuan Yin was often worshipped to bring the devotee to enlightenment, but also to bring the devotee a safe childbirth, as well as to be reborn a good life in the next incarnation. The earliest depiction of Kuan Yin in her female form is the image often called the white-robed Kuan Yin. This is the most general, simplistic, and purest form of the Bodhisattva, which many devotees recognize. This depiction shows the Bodhisattva in a white robe, often with a white head covering. She is often shown with a book in one hand, a sutra, particularly the Lotus Sutra, and a set of mala beads in the other. In some images, the sutra is not present, but instead there is a vase, which is meant to represent the compassion of Kuan Yin. And here we go. Kuan Yin, white-robed Kuan Yin, vase, compassion. Represents the compassion which Kuan Yin so freely gives to the entire world. Some scholars claim that the white-robed imagery is actually due to the relationship between Kuan Yin and the white Tara, a Tibetan deity. This white is not related to the white Tara, but actually to the idea of what the white represents. As the author Chungfang Yu claims, the symbol of the mind of enlightenment, which gives birth to all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. One of the more powerful and intense images of the Kuan Yin, which I don't have, unfortunately, is a depiction of her with 1,000 arms and 1,000 eyes. And I'm sure many of us, if we're on Facebook, have probably seen the dance done by the hearing-impaired Chinese performance troupe, where they were all hearing impaired, and when they practiced, they actually used their breath, to create these beautiful movements. They would stand in a line with many people behind them, and they would do these movements with their hands, going all around. If anyone's ever seen that, it's gorgeous. If you haven't, look it up. It's the 1,000, I think it's called something like the 1,000-armed Kuan Yin or something. Just look it up. You'll find it on YouTube, I'm sure. But the performers are actually hearing impaired, and so it's really impressive to see what they can actually do. They do a really great job with that as well. And sometimes she's depicted with 11 heads and those 1,000 arms, or sometimes only with one head and 1,000 arms. This iconography is one which is common also to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. This may be where the imagery originates with Kuan Yin. However, there is a connection myth which also explains how Kuan Yin came to be depicted with the 1,000 arms. So the myth goes that this myth is associated with Miao Shan, the Chinese princess who I mentioned earlier, who is regarded as the incarnation of the Bodhisattva. Miao Shan was the daughter of a Chinese king who became very ill and with an incurable disease. It was said that only he could be cured by taking a treatment which was made from the eyes and hands of someone who had never felt anger. The Princess Miao Shan gave these willingly to the king so that he would be healed. She was very pure and very sweet, and she'd never known anger, and so she gave her own eyes and her own hands so that her father would be healed. Some scholars have different points of view as to how Miao Shan became associated with the plurality, of the bodily features. Some claim that after Miao Shan made her sacrifice, she transformed into her true form, Super Saiyan, the form of Kuan Yin with 1,000 hands. Others have a less interesting story as to how she became associated with the image. After the princess's death, due to the loss of her limbs, the king commissioned the building of a statue in her honor, but said that he wanted the statue created without hands or eyes. The sculptor misunderstood because allegedly in Chinese the word without sounds similar to the word 1,000. So the sculptor created the statue instead with 1,000 hands and eyes. From the mistake, Kuan Yin had become from that point on depicted with all those features. So just an interesting story there. It seems that the most logical process of development came from Kuan Yin's connection with Avalokiteshvara, as he was shown in a similar way. The depiction of a bodhisattva with 1,000 hands and eyes, especially a bodhisattva who is associated with compassion and mercy, seems to suggest the idea that the bodhisattva is capable of reaching out and saving all beings with its many arms. The Miao Shan myth may have come later on account for why the Bodhisattva was depicted with so many limbs, since Avalokiteshvara was depicted in this manner for many, many years before Kuan Yin was transformed from being male. Another really interesting image of Kuan Yin is Kuan Yin as mother. Now, I do have a statue of Kuan Yin as mother, but unfortunately I don't have it here. It's actually at work. This is the form that's most often depicted similar to the white-robed Kuan Yin, but in the form she is carrying a child as well. A number of scrolls speak of this form of Kuan Yin, and the chanting of these scrolls is believed to bring the devotee many, many blessings. The scrolls outline how the Bodhisattva attends to all children on a daily basis, and they are always in her care. The imagery of Kuan Yin often takes one of these forms, and there are many less popular forms as well. She is often either standing or sitting, and often she is atop a lotus flower or sometimes even standing on a turtle. She is normally shown alone, though sometimes she can be shown with other attendants or Buddhas. Alongside from the different stylized forms of Kuan Yin, there are also some minor objects which she is frequently shown with that have their own unique symbolism in relationship to her devotion and veneration. She is also shown with other objects such as a lotus, which colors have particular meanings. Also a mirror sometimes, which represents wisdom, a rosary or mala, a sword representing her ability to subdue water spirits, a vajra or vajra bell, a bow, an arrow, a multitude of other different weapons, and she is also depicted with her hands taking the form of one of many mudras. Also, she is sometimes shown carrying a willow branch, as in the white-robed version with the pouring vase that I showed earlier. In the vase image is almost always coupled with that. The willow branch is a feminine symbol of Chinese symbolism, and is also represents the ability of Kuan Yin to banish evil spirits. The willow branch is also sometimes represented to interpret her capability of driving away illness as well. Since the original worship of Kuan Yin, there have been many stories about the miracles that she has performed. One could liken these stories similar to stories about Jesus, a compassionate being who performs wondrous miracles to better the lives of others and save them from misery and death. One of the more interesting stories associated with Kuan Yin is a creation story of which she is a part. In the story, Kuan Yin descends to Earth after the creation to teach animals how to live in peace with one another. After a period, the Bodhisattva returned to heaven, but fighting broke out among the creatures of Earth, and so she returned back again. Several times she traveled back to heaven, yet had to come back to Earth to deal with problems on Earth. Finally, in her wisdom, though, Kuan Yin devised a plan. She would find someone who could be present on Earth and remind all beings that she was watching over them, even if she wasn't there. This being she chose was the peacock. The peacock was once a drab and ordinary bird, but was transformed by Kuan Yin into a magnificent bird with 100 eyes on its tail feathers to remind all beings that the Bodhisattva was always watching and did indeed hear the cries and concerns of the world. The inspiring story further illustrates the idea that Kuan Yin is interested in the lives of all beings and is concerned about removing their suffering. In addition to those stories, there are countless stories about all the miraculous things that she has done, which are contributed to Kuan Yin. Many stories about the Bodhisattva include accounts of dangerous situations, physical manifestations, and transformations, which often lead to Kuan Yin saving some devotee from harm. Many of these stories originate around her sacred island, which was the center of her worship at one point in time. An interesting point made by those who study Kuan Yin is that she is not a magical being who performs mysterious and magical feats out of thin air. She is able to make things happen only with the things that are available. She does not perform unnatural or illogical miracles, only natural and physically possible with the laws of physics. But many of the stories which display the miracles of Kuan Yin emphasize her role as universal savior. Stories are told of her ability to save individuals from being murdered, from prison, from dangers of water, although there are many stories which relate to a myriad of other topics. The most common deals with childbirth. Kuan Yin was often prayed to for favorable childbearing in hopes that mothers would have sons. This fact illustrates just how important Kuan Yin was to prospective mothers and suggests that many of her devotees may have actually just been mothers. The development of the Bodhisattva of compassion did not stop with the introduction to China. Kuan Yin's worship traveled further to the east, where it moved into other parts of Asia, and changed slightly as it went. So it went from India being, Tibet, India being picked up, moved to China when the Buddhism was brought to China, and of course then eventually it made its way to Japan. In Japan, China, and other surrounding countries, the Bodhisattva primarily depicted as female. She is, I apologize. She is known as Kwanin, Kwanin-sama, or Kanin in Japan. As with so many things taken by Japan from China, Japan imported Buddhism into the country. Similarly, the Lotus Sutra was translated into Japanese and affected bringing the teachings to the island nation. One of the most important and influential individuals who led to the introduction of Buddhism was the Prince Shotoku. And being part of the royal court, he was very influential in the integration of this foreign religious movement, also developed, of course, to Kuan. Interestingly as well, some regard the prince as being another incarnation of the Bodhisattva because of his zeal in incorporating Buddhism. Interesting. Japan became very significant in the development of Kuan Yin, or as they call her, Kwanin. After her introduction to the country, many unique forms of ideology developed. Japan later developed a total of 33 manifestations of the Bodhisattva, which later became viewed as incarnations of her on Earth. In relationship to the Chinese ideology, Japan placed more emphasis on reincarnation of Kwanin, as opposed to simply regarding these manifestations as symbolic. Another unique development in Japan is that although Kuan Yin is not restricted to any particular religious group, she is accepted by Buddhist as well as Shinto practitioners as a deity. In Shinto thought, the Bodhisattva is the deity Izunonsome, who fled Japan to India to avoid the pressures of Korean gods who infiltrated and then took a male form to better relate to his followers. This Japanese story seems to be the way of validating Kuan Yin's position within the Shinto pantheon, while at the same time accounting for the historical progression of her development from the Indian Avalokiteshvara to the Japanese Kuan Yin. This bodhisattva is a very popular figure in film and literature, and these mediums play a very important role in how she's viewed. One interesting source for this form of information is a very ancient piece of literature titled Monkey, Journey to the West. This book was written in the 16th century during the Ming Dynasty in China. I'm sure many people have heard of this or some variation. There have been the book written. It's a very, very long book. There's also a movie written, and there was also some on television. There's also, just recently, I believe, they came out with a new, on Netflix or something, came out with a new version of this as well. The book was written again in the 16th century. The book is ultimately about the rowdy monkey who later travels with a Buddhist monk, and he brings Buddhist teachings back to China from India. Love this story. I love it. The text is fictional, a fantastical story that is based loosely on historical fact. The Bodhisattva Kuan Yin plays a marginal role in the text, occupying only about 2 chapters, but her influence is far-reaching, and it illustrates how Chinese viewed this being at the time the text was written. In the story, Kuan Yin arrives in the 6th chapter to a feast being held by the Jade Emperor, the supreme ruler of heaven in Taoist mythology and cosmology. She comes from a particular mountain, having been invited by the wife of the emperor to the festival. Although Kuan Yin does not directly deal with the monkey, she offers many options of how to deal with the issue. How others could deal with the issue of monkey being rowdy and causing all this drama, if you haven't ever seen the movie or the book. She is there to bring insight and clarity to the situation. In the 8th chapter of the book, Kuan Yin volunteers to go forward and find someone who would bring the scriptures into China. The text describes her as thus, quote, "Her pure bottle of sweet dew is ever full. The willow twigs in it are always green. She delivers from the 8 disasters, saves all living beings. Great is her compassion. Rescues the suffering when she bears their cries, never failing to answer every call. She is infinitely divine and miraculous." Of course, that is a quote from the text, the monkey. The book. Although the text is fictional and seemingly unimportant, it may illustrate how the Chinese viewed Kuan Yin with their cosmology. Journey to the West illustrates the relationship between Kuan Yin, the Buddha, Confucianism, and Taoism. In Chinese thought, these 3 religions are not separate, but they were really closely related. The relationships between these characters represents the closeness among these 3 traditions. In Chinese thought, Kuan Yin is not simply a bodhisattva, but she is also a divine being who is at the same level as Taoist deities and saints. She is an attendant of the Buddha, but resides in her own divine realm and has diplomatic relationships with the other divine beings. This liberal point of view is one held by Chinese for much of their religious history prior to the rise of communism. A more modern film which is relevant to Kuan Yin is The Lost Empire. The film is a more modern rendition of the Wu story, The Journey to the West. This film may suggest how the image of Kuan Yin has changed over the generations and across nations. In the film, Kuan Yin is depicted as loving, caring, yet also as a warrior. She fights against the forces of nature with martial arts and attempts to save the world. The same characters in the text by Wu are also in the film, including Monkey, Pig, the Jade Emperor, and Confucius. The film does depart from the commonly held beliefs about Kuan Yin. Because she is a pacifist, her depiction as a martial arts using warrior is not really congruent with her worship. In the end of the film, though, Kuan Yin falls in love with the main character and chooses to be reborn as a human instead of as a goddess to live her life with him. This also goes against the more commonly held beliefs because a bodhisattva is one who reaches enlightenment. Thus, they renounce all worldly pleasures. These other aspects of Kuan Yin may be interjections of Hollywood, but they may also have more profound understandings of divinity which appear in the West. The lover is a very common archetype in modern Western culture, and it also appears in the film's rendition of Kuan Yin. These examples are but two of the many instances where the great Bodhisattva has entered popular thought and has been depicted in music, literature, and film. The study of Kuan Yin is a fascinating and captivating study. She is the savior who is full of compassion and mercy. She is one who hears the cries of the world and is willing to help all beings in need without exception. She is not restrained by any religion or dogma and may be worshipped or called upon in any time of need. It seems that she is the embodiment of essence of the female divine in the form of the Sacred Mother. She is the yin to the yang of the universe, and her worship is full of joy and faith. She fulfills the profound need for humanity to look towards something outside itself, to a greater truth. She embodies the qualities of the female aspects of the divine beings cross-culturally, and she may appear in any of these forms to help those in need. It could be said that the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin is the quintessential form of divinity due to the fact that she is capable of appearing in both male and female forms, as well as having the ability to intercede on her followers' behalf. She is truly a divine and profound being. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to, watch this video and learn a little bit about Kuan Yin. Hopefully, you can have, better appreciation of Kuan Yin, of the relationship to Kuan Yin and Eastern culture as well as Western culture, and kind of give you a little bit of an understanding of the juxtaposition between Eastern cultural and religious climate, as well as Western culture and religious climate, how they're different, and how a deity like Kuan Yin, having been a bodhisattva reserved to Buddhism, could have grown in such a way that she's now a separate deity that is honored by many people across the world, across culturally, across religions as well. So hopefully you enjoyed this as well. I do want to say though that the information provided in this video comes from a essay that I wrote for a college class about Buddhism, and I specifically wrote mine on Kuan Yin, not just about her specifically, but about her transitions from being a male bodhisattva to being a female goddess of compassion, mercy, and childbirth, wisdom, and all that sort of thing. So this was actually from my materials and from materials that I wrote a couple years ago. So hopefully you enjoyed that. I will be including at the end of this a sort of works cited with some information, so if anyone would like to read more about it, that there will be some information at the end of the video there. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. Until next time, I hope you have a great next couple of holidays, and blessed be.